No country, no community is able to solve the complex problems of our world alone. We need to come together, not only to talk, but to listen. It is absolutely essential that you all join the conversation. We need your opinions, your strategies, your ideas for us to be able to deliver better for the people of the world that we must serve.
Well, thanks for joining. My name is Alex Anvari. Today's webinar is a part of a series, Engaging Informed Citizens, sponsored by the United Nations Association. Also sponsoring these events are the neighboring UNA chapters from Connecticut, Westchester County, Bronx, and Southern New York. Our website is unaswct.org. Please visit and subscribe to receive announcements about our events, programs, and organization. At our website, you'll find details on the registration link for June 4th webinar about disinformation in the plays of Shakespeare and the parallels of literature with our lives today. June 10th, you'll hear from Native Americans about how the news and education are a battleground against disinformation about history and the present. Taking back the narrative is an ongoing theme across disciplines for advocates. And later in June, we are scheduling an event about biodiversity, countering science denialism, and promoting local activism to protect this environment from spoilage by private interests that oppose the public good. All these webinars are intended to be teach-ins. You will hear from recognized experts. To get us started today, I propose the #1 most important action to promote global health is being an ally with the nations, institutions, and peoples of the world. This is like war. The virus is attacking our people, our prosperity, and our way of life. We need to address this as a collective, as an allied cause. So let's remind ourselves what it means to be an ally. At the founding of NATO in 1949, the Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, said something very applicable today on being an ally. The reality which is set down to here today is not created here today. The reality is the unity of belief, of spirit of interest, of the community of nations represented here. It is the product of centuries of common thought. Today, we are looking at centuries of thought with our speakers today who will help us to realize healthcare is a human right. All the countries of the world agreed to that when ratifying the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a founding document of the United Nations. Article 25 specifically raises access to healthcare as a human right. Today's teach-in will take us deeper into a range of initiatives that support health. For example, equitable treatment of all social identities, gender, age, national origin. We will learn how safe housing, food security, and access to education are all determinants of health. COVID-19 has exposed a lot of issues. The supply chain of pharmaceuticals and medical devices has been stretched around the world and is unstable. Innovation and science are under attack to create political advantage. Regulation has failed to moderate market dysfunction. These are all topics for another day. If you're a teacher who will teach us about that, please contact me. Today, we're looking for action. Our 2 university professors from Sacred Heart will illuminate not just the reality, but also the vision of what can be done with diligent advocacy. Both are members of the United Nations Association because we are an organization of impactful volunteers. Please lend us your passion, your intelligence, drive, and volunteerism. This webinar is being recorded for replay. You will receive that link. Please share it. There will be polls, and you will be encouraged to send Q&A and chat through Zoom so we can address as much as we can today. Let me introduce Christina Gunther, Director of Global Health Programs and the Health Science Program at Sacred Heart University, and Bronwyn Cross-Denny, Associate Professor at the School of Social Work, Sacred Heart University. Thank you for being here with us today, Christina and Bronwyn.
Thank you so much, Alex. We're delighted to be here. And I will share my screen. Alex, I think I need your help with this. It says disabled.
Okay, now try now, Christine.
Thank you. It looks like it's going to work now. Okay. All right, so everyone should now see my screen, and Bronwyn and I will be going back and forth, sharing what knowledge we have on COVID-19 and how it has exposed inequities in healthcare, and then discuss, along with all of you, what we can do as advocates for social justice. So Bronwyn, I will turn it to you for the first slide.
Wonderful. And I just want to say to everyone that I welcome Christina to interject.
and vice versa.
That's kind of our style. So, racism is the underlying condition for health and inequity. And, you know, in terms of employment, housing, incarceration, income, and education. And this is really about the social determinants of health. So social identities and categories that impact health and access to health care. And these include race, age, gender, class. And it's a distribution of power and resources, and really access to resources and identifying where you have privilege or lack of privilege.
Yes, and as Alex mentioned, we are all promised in Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of ourselves and our family, which does include food, clothing, housing, and medical care and social services. And of course, the World Health Organization defines health as not just the absence of disease, but the total emotional and physical well-being of a person. And that is quite important in particular with COVID, and what COVID has highlighted, as we can see in these astonishing numbers, that not everyone does have that total emotional and physical well-being. So the numbers are affecting us in different ways depending on what racial group you are a part of, because unfortunately there is a lot of racism, as Bronwyn mentioned. And Bronwyn, I'll turn it to you for an explanation of the numbers.
I'm sorry, Christina, I cut you off.
No, I was just turning it to you.
So this is really quite telling and illustrates, you know, the enormous gap. So of the cases by race, and we only have, so of the 1,500,000 cases, only 500,000, we have data on race. So from that data, we have 27% of the cases are African American or Black, and 52% are white. Yet the population of those races, respectively, is 13.4% is African American and 76.5% is white. And I think okay, there we go. So here's some graphs. Of course, I like graphs, pictures, say 1,000 words. This illustrates that as well in terms of cases and population. But if we take a deeper dive, and I think there's a delay here. There we go. So if we take a deeper dive, we look at, again, 27% of the cases are African American, but they only occupy 13.4% of the actual population. And we do also have some data in terms of hospitalizations, and Hispanics or Latinos make up 18% of the cases of hospitalizations of the data that we have, and they are only 8% of the population. Um, so let's take a look at the dimensions of inequality. So we have, of course, testing and treatment and health outcomes. And this is really represented as reported in the Stanford Advocate, that the low income in Connecticut, those with low income are being turned away from testing. They don't have the access. Testing sites are drive-through, and a large percentage of people of color do not have cars. And then the low income population from low income is not represented in the governor's response and reopening committee. So they are lacking a voice. And again, lack of racial and ethnic testing data, their inability to social distance, given their living conditions and working access, they need to work, and housing and other social determinants, and again, access to economic stimulus. So, you know, the stimulus package that went out is not going to make a dent in helping this population.
So we have something for you to do right now, as we talk about, well, you know, what is this inequity about? And just if you get out your phones, or you can do this on your computer, if you go to on the internet, you can go to polev.com/ChristinaGunn146, or you can text Christina Gunn 146 to 37607. Okay, and then you can vote A or B. Is it true or false that race is biological? So just take a minute now, if you would, and vote. We should start seeing the lines moving if all works well. Ah, here we go. We got someone voting. Great. Okay, here we go. All right, so right now, oh, it's moving. Okay, wonderful. All right. Yeah. Okay. All right, so right now, 50% say, oh, nope, sorry, we're moving some more. Okay. So about 56% of us say, yes, race is biological, and 44% say race is not biological. Oh no, we're back to 50%, 50-50. Okay, so it's about 50-50. Well, those of you who said that it's false, race is biological is false, you are correct. Race is not biological. It is a social construct, completely made up. It's about skin color only, and the Genome Project verified this unequivocally. There is only 0.1% difference between any of us biologically on Earth in terms of our biological makeup. That doesn't mean DNA, but we are all the same. Race is purely skin deep. And so that is why we started with saying, well, this is all about racism. Inequity in health is due to racism, and that's due to a lot of structural racism and individual racism. But the structural racism has legacies of slavery, so it's a real inability for Blacks or African Americans to accumulate wealth. And you all probably heard of 40 acres and a mule. Well, that was what was promised to freed slaves as reparation, 40 acres and a mule, and they never received that. So they were left with nothing. They were brought over here against their will with nothing, and then once freed, they were still left with nothing. There have been a lot of examples of that throughout history. Another is with the GI Bill. Blacks or African Americans fought in World War II alongside their white peers, and when they returned home, white soldiers were offered the GI Bill, which helped with housing and with education, yet if you were Black or African American, you were not given that that privilege. Then we saw a lot of redlining, which caused segregation. I'm sure we all are familiar with redlining, and that had government support where realtors would actually draw red lines on maps, segregating people of color to those areas, which had the effect of moving this population of people into an environment that had a lot of hazards. They're often near factories, so they're exposed to chemical hazard. There was little tax dollars, and as we know, our education is funded through property ownership. And so they were again marginalized through the process of redlining. Now, this did become illegal, but we still see it in very subtle ways. So this all happened through categorization of people in order to maintain white privilege and supremacy. And so sociologists will say, you know, that it's the powerful who will always try to remain powerful and have more access to resources. This started categorizing people by race, started with slavery. Before that, it was based on religion. And then it started with slavery, and then it evolved. We can see through history that at one time the Irish were considered non-white, the Italians were considered non-white, but those groups of people were able to break those barriers that define them by the white majority. But Blacks and unfortunately Hispanics have not yet been able to do that. Whether they will, I don't know. And I see I have an old friend here who's a student, and we'll get to questions in just a minute. That's wonderful. Okay, so what COVID-19 has done has really illuminated these inequities that have existed for a very long time, but they're showing through those who have underlying conditions are faring far worse, and the underlying conditions do not have to do with biology, which is a hard concept sometimes to wrap our heads around because we do practice such racialized medicine in the US. I'm sure many of us have heard, well, African Americans are more prone to diabetes, or sickle cell is a Black disease. Well, it was named a Black disease in 1910 when Blacks were gaining power in communities, and the American Medical Association labeled it as a Black disease because of issues of power and resources, when actually sickle cell has to do with regions of the world. So it's an adaptation from the malaria transmitting mosquitoes. And interestingly, there's also a high prevalence for people of Greek descent to have sickle cell because of that region of the world that has the more malaria carrying mosquitoes. We also see the environment that we segregated people to, that has a lack of access to healthcare, lack of access to healthy foods. We call them food deserts. And you can go into these areas and see fast food restaurants on every corner of the street with their dollar menus, and that's inexpensive food that's also addictive food. And we also, there's lots of research showing that stress based on perceived discrimination is causing lots of health issues, particularly cardiovascular disease and preterm birth. So just as an example, getting back to diabetes and it not being biological, in these poorer neighborhoods, these poorer environments, either low birth weight or high birth weight is common. Low birth weight because of poor nutrition or the expected mother. High birth weight is often due to gestational diabetes that is also linked to diet. And both of these conditions are linked to obesity and diabetes in adulthood. Because we have more of these type births with African American or Black women, the medical field is associating this with a higher prevalence of diabetes. It does not have to do with biology, however, it has to do with the environment. And in these environments as well, there's inability to social distance. Housing or apartment style living, they're very close together. There's often many generations in one house or apartment, and they're going out to working conditions that aren't safe, whether it be in a factory setting or in a fast food restaurant. They're connecting to others very closely in unsafe working conditions and then bringing them back home to these crowded living conditions, and so it's spreading faster. So that's what is happening with these inequities in COVID-19 cases and then deaths. So we may not be aware of this, and certainly of the racialized medicine, because we do see the world the way we are. And Bronwyn is going to describe to us how we need to perceive ourselves and the outside world by becoming more self-aware. So Bronwyn, I will turn it back over to you to describe this.
So we're talking about unconscious bias and social stereotypes. And when I teach this material at the university, and I talk about the socialization, that we are just steeped in all sorts of attitudes, values, beliefs, and myths. And one of those is stereotypes. And I will ask students, I'll say, how many of you are, have stereotypes? We should all be raising our hands because we all hold stereotypes. When we don't know how to fill in those blanks and needing to make quick judgments, we use stereotypes. And I'll oftentimes say, okay, and a large majority of social workers or social work students are women, and I'll say to them, so as a woman and you're out at night and you're going to your parked car, what do you do? And oftentimes you'll carry, the keys in your hands and protect yourself. And if you see a group of people there in the dark, you get nervous. And so you automatically think it's going to be somebody that is going to harm you, when in fact maybe it's a group of friends or a group of your associates.
And
so we
do jump in.
Yes, please.
Sorry. I just love this example, if I can share, that Paul Gorski, who's an equity theorist, writes about, and it's about driving in the car on a highway with a friend, and they were cut off by a woman driver, and the friend who's driving says, "Oh, women are just such horrible drivers." And we have that stereotype of the soccer mom in the minivan who's a terrible driver. And what Paul Gorski points out is, well, we have this stereotype, and what happens when we have this is we look for confirming situations. So his friend was probably, driving on the highway hundreds, thousands of times with women drivers who never cut him off. But this instance where a woman driver did cut him off confirmed the stereotype about women drivers, and we're more likely to believe that about a stereotype that's existing, or about others who are not like us.
And actually, Christina, the data shows that women drivers are actually more careful, and
Yes.
thus the insurance
That's true.
rates for women are lower than for men. So, so we use stereotypes as a way, sometimes in terms of survival and being able to make those quick judgments. But then there's stereotypes which are turn out to be false. And we need to work on our unconscious bias and to be recognizing when we're holding those biases and doing something to reverse that thinking, which again, we are steeped, and I often say we're pickled in that. So let's see, what other things was I going to say? So, in terms of unconscious bias, what that does is it creates an environment of oppression. And I consider oppression to be defined as something that has heavy pressure and a burden. And when people are oppressed, especially for a long period of time over generations, that they become more vulnerable to all sorts of situations, especially in terms of health and health risks. Okay, Christina, I think you're next.
I'm up. Okay.
You're up.
Okay, so one of the things that needs to happen to create more equity is we need more access to health care for people of color. And we are the only developed nation that does not provide healthcare coverage for all of its people. So in terms of viewing healthcare as a human right, we're not following through on that, and it's an issue of social justice, right? So with the Affordable Care Act, we were able to expand Medicaid in 32 states. We did cover 12 million additional people with the Affordable Care Act. But what non-coverage does is lead obviously to a lack of health, but also it leads to an increase in relying on government programs. One of the other things is access to quality education needs to expand, and access to IT and internet. So a lot of the things we're seeing, like I'm wearing one myself, is a Fitbit. And I can track my steps, and I can track my calories, and I can track my heart rate, and IT is going to widen the gap for people who do not have access to these types of wearable devices that can monitor our health. And we have lots of that increasing. There are more and more devices that are being used in healthcare that marginalized groups just do not have access to. So one of those, a few of those ways is to expand Medicaid coverage, increase quality education, access to that, access to the internet and IT. And of course, COVID has really identified the fact that we often, as the people who are privileged, don't think about the fact that who doesn't have IT right now? Well, many people, and they used to go to libraries or go to schools for access, and now they're closed. So COVID has really identified this gap in marginalized people. So we have all seen a true call to action on these inequitable issues that have been here a long time. But one of the positives of COVID-19 is that there is identification, especially in the media, about these inequitable situations. And we have a list in a minute of some press that is very responsibly reported on these inequities that we'll show you. But what is our call to action? How do we help? Well, we need equitable social policies. Number one, we need paid sick leave for everyone. If you are an hourly worker, you can't take time off to go to a healthcare appointment, or you can't quarantine at home. We need affordable and stable housing, fair economic policies, access to educational resources, and universal healthcare, as I mentioned. And this will strengthen health for everyone, because we can see in a pandemic that anyone who is sick, it doesn't stay in that area, it spreads, right? There are no borders, so we're all vulnerable. But we need this self-awareness so that we know where we need to act. We can't wait for a pandemic to highlight what is needed in equity. So Bronwyn, tell us how we can be advocates.
So, one of the, I'm a social worker, and just, to tell you what social workers use as the definition of social justice. So from the National Association of Social Workers, is social justice is the view that everyone deserves equal economic, political, and social rights and opportunities. And so one of the things that social workers do, and everyone can do, is to be an advocate and to work with Congress, to let your voice be heard, to go and vote, to work in your community. How can you help your community in making positive change? Working with the media. The media is a very powerful source of getting the word out and letting voices be heard. And then actions that you can take towards social justice. What can you do in your world that can create change? And one of the things that I think is really important is to develop this self-awareness of, what do I have to do with the problem? What is my role and what is my responsibility? And I often talk about how responsibility, if you have privilege, you also have responsibility in making change because you have the power to do that. So the next slide is, again, we're going to do a little poll. And so have you contacted your senators or representatives to take legislative action? And specifically, I think that we're talking about really in general. Have you ever contacted your senator and representative in general? So we'll give a minute here. I just love these polls.
I know I do too. I like watching them. Okay, wonderful. Of course, this group, probably many in this group have. Okay, we're looking at about 89%.
Great.
Yeah, it's moving. Okay, so it looks like the majority have done that, which is really, really wonderful.
And so the majority may have done it, but they probably know people that haven't. And so what prevents people from contacting your representative?
Abject fear of the phone.
Yes.
But I still done it.
Yeah, and you might not know who your senator or representative is.
Or what bills they're sponsoring or not sponsoring, but there's a lovely website that will tell you for both the House and the Senate who is sponsoring which bills.
Right. And also at the state level as well. And so again, to send an email, make a phone call, write a letter. And one of the things that I've done is I'm following my representatives and senators, and I get updates either every day or every week from them about what is happening. So and most of them have an Instagram account or Facebook, and you can really get the information that you need. So back to you, Christina.
Okay, thanks, Bronwyn. And what's up in legislation right now is the HEROES Act, and this has directly to do with COVID-19. So go back to that website, find out if your senator or representatives are supporting this, and if not, email them, call them, write a letter, and we do teach our students to be advocates. So I was doing a program one time about showing students how you can call your representative. It's so easy, and I demonstrated by picking up the phone. It was the first time I'd done it, and I have a phone phobia, so I was paralyzed with fear, but it was so easy. And you're likely going to be talking to an aide, and that's their job. Their job is to do this. And I called Jim Himes, and I told him I wanted him to support SNAP, which, you know, is formerly food stamps, and it's the first line of defense against hunger in the U.S. And it was designed actually to respond to a crisis like this. So it was really easy, and I actually got a personalized letter signed by Jim Himes in return. And I thought, wow, I can really use my voice to get out there. So the HEROES Act is really needing people's voices right now. So please consider contacting your Congress people to get this passed. And another way is letters to the editor. So here's our last poll. Have you sent a letter to your editor of your local paper? Not if it's published, but have you just sent it? Let us know.
And while we're waiting for those, I have a funny story. When after Sandy Hook happened, and, you know, being a mental health professional, I wrote a letter to President Obama. I got on the website, and so, you know, maybe like it was in May. I received this package, and my husband yells up to me, "You got something from the White House," and it was a proclamation of Mental Health Awareness Month in May, and a letter from President Obama to Brahma Cross Denny. So they respond.
They really do. They do. But one of the really powerful tools is to write a letter to the editor. And I see that most of us on this webinar have not. And that is understandable. It's not something that we think of typically, but it's such an important tool for advocacy. And you could write an op-ed, you can meet with the editorial board of your local paper. For example, I've met with the editorial board of Stanford Advocate. I've not had a personal op-ed published, but a student's op-ed was published, and I've had a story about me and another person doing some work with SNAP published. You can write an article. There's a lot of things you can do. They're really powerful, and members of Congress, their teams scour, or they have tools that scour local papers every single day, and they will put these op-eds or articles right in front of your Congress people and saying, look at what your constituents are saying. So it's a very powerful tool that anybody can do. And then the other way is we can work with communities, as we mentioned, and those are easy. Host a table at an event that on a particular piece of legislation that you think is really important. Organize a letter writing meeting with your neighbors or friends in your community. Speak to local community groups. That's what Bronwyn and I are doing now about work that we are very, very passionate about. Or organize an action network. All of these are really important, and I invite you, if you would now, to just type some ideas in the chat. If you've done anything, or if you have ideas that maybe you're thinking about right now, please type in the chat for us, and we'll look at that when we get to the Q&A portion of our talk. But we're running out of time here, so we just want to wrap up. I'm going to turn it back to Bronwyn so she can talk to you about how to build your own self-awareness of implicit bias, which, by the way, implicit bias we all have. We're not conscious of it, but we all have implicit biases that are primed in our environments.
And it's a lifetime of recovery.
Yes.
And just before I talk about that, I want to say something in terms of volunteering in your community. So I live in Stanford, and there is a great need in terms of volunteers, either your medical reserve corps or, you know, there are opportunities. I'm helping Stanford right now develop a hotline specifically for our community. So, and a mental health hotline. So there are all sorts of ways that you can help and contribute. And of course, that starts with us, right? And building our own self-awareness and conducting a self-evaluation, seeking resources. There's a really wonderful implicit association test, and that we give that in our resources, where you can go and you can do a self-evaluation of the implicit biases that you hold. And embrace your racial identity development, and that, you know, and especially if you are someone of privilege, if you are someone white like I am, to be constantly looking at how you contribute to the problem and how you can work on yourself to help solve the problem.
And it's particularly hard in the US because we don't talk about race. We have a sense of color blindness, really, and what that does is harm others.
Right.
We feel like that's more polite, but it actually minimizes important differences that really should be celebrated.
And it perpetuates the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, becoming an ally, what Alex had talked about at the very beginning. How can you become an ally? How can you align with people who have less privilege, people who are harmed by the events that are happening in our world today, especially with COVID, but, you know, other numerous ways. And how can you help bring that to light and take action to eliminate those problems?
Yes. And so we put together this last slide here on resources, and we will share, well, this is recorded, so you'll receive the recording, but we can also share these with Alex. But as Bronwyn mentioned, you can take an implicit association test. You can learn more about unconscious bias, learn more about race, and the fact that it's not at all biological, and the history of how race as a category has changed throughout our history in US. And we have lots of other readings here for you that you can look through. And with that, we just want to say thank you so much. Bronwyn and I are so passionate about this, and we appreciate, thank you, Alex, for inviting us here today, and thanks to you all for joining us. So,
wow, that was great. Thank you very much, Christina and Bronwyn. We appreciate the compelling call to action because we are an activist organization. Now, we have some responses that I think are worth calling out as well. Recommendations about activism from Charlene: poll standing, making phone calls for campaigns, helping mail absentee ballots, signing petitions, and joining your local town committee. From Marcia, from the UNA chapter in Westchester, we are doing a lot of postcarding to people in Georgia and South Carolina who have been dropped from the voter rolls. Very important that we maintain our pressing forward with expressing ourselves in the political system. Patricia offers a book titled Waking Up White by Debbie Irving, is a great resource on privilege. Now I have one great comment that came from a UN Model UN chapter at a local high school. How do you think Indigenous rights factor into the COVID-19 crisis? I've heard a lot about how Indigenous communities and nations like the Navajo have been disproportionately affected. Do you think American stereotypes about natives will affect how the US government addresses this disparity?
That's really a good question and very tough. And so those Native Americans who use their health system, the reservation health system, it's really terrible and inadequate. And they also have pre-existing conditions. They have a lot of cardiovascular disease. There's a lot more obesity now because as all of you know, what we did was, we took their land and then gave them back the worst land in the US, and they can't grow things, and so they're really in the middle of nowhere, and they rely on foods from the government that are, you know, canned and high in sodium and really unhealthy. So I think they have, I don't think COVID is going to help them get any more resources, unfortunately, because of how horribly we still treat them.
So from a childhood friend of mine, my daughter is studying sociology. These webinars would be perfect for her. I forwarded her the link. I hope she registers, and I would just encourage everybody else to share the recording when you receive it. We have a thank you, a very nice comment from Tracy. So interesting and insightful. Thank you so much for sharing your experience, Christina and Bronwyn. It's people like you who are changing the world.
Oh, thank you.
From Karen, I think a lot of our biases start at an early age.
Yes.
Are there opportunities for Zoom meetings for schools to do a meet your neighbor, where children can talk to other children from different schools?
If I can just interject there, I think that perhaps the biggest dent that we can make, or the action that I think is you know, the most impactful is, well, two actions: education and dialogue. Mm-hmm. And yes, if it can start at an early age, because, you know, socialization starts before we're even born. So, you know, so again, for, you know, education, not only about these issues, but also about yourself, and then talking about it.
Yes, and if there are any parents on, you know, try advocate at your kids' schools to start a program. That there are two professors in our College of Education at Sacred Heart, actually, who do have they run a program. I don't know if they're still doing it, but they were, between, I think it was a Trumbull school and a Bridgeport. It's definitely a Bridgeport school, and I believe it was Trumbull. I'm not positive, but it was sort of, they became buddies. They paired up the kids and they had all this interaction. And I think that's really critical, because if we don't have, you know, the opportunity to interact, we don't know.
So we have a comment question from Suzanne. How do you foresee mental health problems that may be caused or made worse by this current crisis, specifically PTSD, anxiety, and how may marginalized populations experience greater disparity both now and after this pandemic?
Well, I think that, you know, that marginalized populations are already at greater risk. And so we're seeing, you know, mental health issues across the board. And so I think that, you know, they are at special risk. And then you also have addiction, right? So, you know, some of us joke about, you know, being concerned about running out of wine, you know, and that an essential service that is open are liquor stores. So, you know, that's also going to be another issue. And I think there's going to be great impact, and I think there's going to be long-lasting effects from this.
Yeah, and unfortunately in these, you know, areas with marginalized people, we see more liquor stores and more, you know, fast food stores and things like that just contribute to the problem instead of helping it. So I think that as Bronwyn said, it's going to be a huge issue for everyone in terms of mental health, but certainly more exacerbated in these marginalized racial populations. And unfortunately, what's really sad, and I remember when I first realized that what happens to them, well, they die, and that's what happens. It's so very sad.
Sorry, we have a couple more minutes. If any participants would like to type in a chat or a Q&A, we won't be calling on hands. We're going to leave that for a future session. We hope that people that want to say something will join in a roundtable discussion to be scheduled really every week. We have a roundtable session around our planning for events at the United Nations Association. We also have a comment here from Charlene. Thank you so much. This is critical and timely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, I'm going to just put up on the screen the website. I would encourage you all to visit. We have a ton of programs. With that, I'm going to draw the webinar to a close. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, Bronwyn. And thank you, all you who participated. Great questions, great discussion. And I do hope that as activists, we can come together in future programs, future events. We welcome your participation. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.